Welcome everyone. It's my pleasure now to introduce Randy. Randy's been around the Joomla community for a good long time now, and he's managed to teach me quite a bit about Joomla's access control levels. Randy's made it a sort of speciality of his to understand how they work and how they can be used for more complex systems. And so I'm excited to listen to Randy today. Welcome, Randy. Thank you very much indeed for coming. And I'm going to pass the screen over to you.
I'm Randy Carey. I'm from Minnesota. I've been working with Joomla for about 5 years now. And as Steve said, I've been doing a lot of work in the ACL. A lot of it has been leading into my real desire, and that's to make the Joomla CMS more usable for those people who manage the site. I work at a project called IQ Project. You can go to iqproject.com. And my view there is that we not just take the Joomla out of the box as we use it for building the sites, but we try to tailor the user experience for managing websites to something more tailored for what our clients and their staff needs to use. And a lot of that relies upon the ACL. How do we give different users their own personalized view? So I'll talk a little bit about that later. First, I want to use an analogy. As we try to navigate to a particular location, we can use the street view, and we start looking around, and we remember to turn at the stop sign, that sort of a thing, and that helps to an extent. What helps even more is if we use a map, because a map shows us how things are connected, maybe gives us the idea of the shortest route to get from one place to another. And if we only can use pictures and sometimes just directions on those pictures, we won't get to the place we want to as efficiently. So I think there's something about using a model or a map to help us envision what it is we're looking at. Similarly with Joomla or any particular system in the ACL, we might be using the street level view like this of going to the site, global configuration, click on this and do that, and we see things down at the ground level. But I think it helps if we can have a model view or a map type of view of the ACL. So when I started digging into the ACL 3-4 years ago, I started looking at how all the different parts, what parts are there, how are they related, and I started building my own map. So much of the talk I'm going to give is not so much on what I call the street level view or just looking at the screens and how you configure things, but I want to give you more of an idea of how the ACL works in a model sense of how the groups and the access levels and permissions interact with the whole system. So the first part, we'll be talking more about that particular model view. The second part, I know a lot of people are interested in permissions and think about permissions a lot. So how do we figure out and calculate permissions? And people get confused. I want to show a simple formula on how we determine if somebody is allowed or denied and what that means. And at the very end, I'll talk a little bit about role-based access control, enabling us to give different users, based upon the roles that we assign them, how do they view the back end differently, depending on what permissions we want to give them. So the first thing is ACL mechanics. And this is what I did for my model. We have groups, we have access levels, and we have permissions. But if we think about the ACL, only these things in white is really what I consider the core ACL. It's what Joomla 3, Joomla 2.5, what they can implement in the core. And they integrate with the users and what I call resources, which is components, modules, menu items, and plugins. But it's the groups, it's the access levels, and it's the permissions. But together they connect what a particular user is able to do or see with the components, modules, menu items, and plugins. I did make permissions a little bit of a gray shaded area here because while the ACL is able to say this is the rules on how we use permissions, how we set up actions, and how we calculate them, it's still a lot of responsibility on the component to implement some of these details. So permissions is actually shared between the ACL and the component, and I will go into more detail on that in a little bit. So the first thing is groups. Groups is really the fundamental portion of the whole ACL. Notice everything points to it. Users are assigned to groups, permissions are based upon the group configurations we have, and access levels are also based upon the group configuration we have. But groups don't know anything about the rest of the system. They are very simple. They're so simple, all we do when you create a group is give it a name, and we tell who its parent is. It knows its name and it knows its parent. But this is very powerful. It allows us to create group hierarchies. Every group in Joomla starts out with a public group and inherits from it. So we can create several different groups, and if we did something like this, each of these groups would be sibling to each other. They all have the same parent, but otherwise they are unrelated. Or we can have a group that is now a child of another group that's a child. Or we can have a group that has multiple children. Or we can have it cascading more like a totem pole. This group has a child which has its own child. Now how does this work in the ACL? The dark red ones are the ones that we will say we have a user and we assign a user to a particular group. Think about that as the dark red ones. They're explicitly checked. This user belongs to this group, to this group, to this group, and to that group. But if a user belongs to a particular group, the user also belongs to the parent groups implicitly. So in this case, in the top one, the top red box, the user belongs to that group but does not belong to the sibling groups because he only belongs to the parent and that particular group. In the second level, we see this child group the user belongs to. Implicitly, the user also belongs to the parent group and then again to public. And here, when we have sibling children, by clicking that this person belongs to the sibling group, this particular child includes its parent but does not include its siblings. And if we have a totem pole sort of thing, we have a user belonging to a middle level one belongs to this group and to the parent group, but not to its child group. So membership in a group implicitly includes the parents and all the way up to the very source, but it never extends out to its siblings, nor does it extend out to its children, unless, of course, those children or siblings also are checked as the user belonging to it. Let's look, this is the default groups that we have. And one of the things we're maybe used to seeing is the author, editor, and publisher. Now the author is inherits or has a parent of registered. The editor has a parent of author, and publisher has a parent of editor. That means an author can create, but unless the author at first has also become an editor, that person cannot edit any other articles. They can only create and edit his or her own. Same with publishing. The only way someone can publish any article in the system is to be checked in this box. Now the way the system comes by default, if you have the ability to publish, you also can edit any article in the system or any item, whatever component you're in, and you also have the ability to create. But if we flatten out the hierarchy, so now that author, editor, and publisher inherit from registered but do not inherit from each other, now we have truly isolated these particular groups and responsibilities. You can make someone a publisher, but it does not inherit that they are also an editor and also an author. They can only publish and unpublish. They cannot edit content. They cannot create content. Likewise, someone can edit content but can't publish and cannot be an author. So that is the differences between having groups inherit from one another versus being siblings. I quite often get rid of many of the groups that we have by default. You are allowed to delete every group except public, and you also have to have a super users group. All the other groups can be deleted. I would keep guest. But a lot of these groups I replace with my own custom groups that have more meaning. For instance, I developed a site for a county that had up to 20 departments. And so I created a base group backend access that anybody belonging to that group can log into the backend. Departments, which had special privileges for somebody who belongs to a department. And then each of the 20 departments would be listed in this group. If somebody belonged to social services, they would have access to all the social services aspects of this website, as well as whatever it means to belong to one of the departments, as long as being able to access the back end. There are also other things that the webmaster might, or other people might want to have permissions for. So I would create very personalized groups, and the new ACL allows you to do that. The importance of groups is that it allows the users then to check which groups they belong to. Groups, remember, are really probably the most foundational and the simplest item in the whole ACL, but they have the power when we say this user belongs to this group, and if it belongs to this group, it might belong to all the groups to which is its parent, and that has relationships or has effects on the permissions and access levels as well. So the users are identified with the groups, And so for any given user, we know what groups they're assigned to, in this case B1 and C, and that also implicitly means B. So when it comes time to look at permissions, they'll only look at the permissions for B1, B, and C. Or access levels, we'll see if the user belongs to one of its access levels that's checked. And we'll talk about those in a little bit. So the users then can check whichever groups they are, but the groups themselves set up their own configuration of inheritance and parents, that sort of thing. Go to resources. This is my own term, resources, and it includes the site configuration, components, along with their optional categories and their items, modules, menu items, and plugins. These I call all resources. Aside from the site configuration, each of these, some might be in core, some might be added by third-party developers, such as different extra components, extra modules. You create your own menu items, and you can have extra plugins than what comes in core. So, and when it comes time to permissions, the resources that tie into permissions would be the site configuration, whether or not you can like log into the back end of the site, for instance. With components, category, and the components have their categories, the objects, and recently in the 3.x version of Joomla, we now allow modules to include permissions. And each of the permissions then maps upon a particular group that we have. And so each component should implement its own permissions. Modules can have permissions, and site can have permissions. But menu items and plugins do not have permissions. Now, permissions is a little more complex, and I'm going to get to that a little bit later in the talk, but I want to show you the whole picture of how all the parts work before I go into more detail. The next thing I want to talk about is access levels, and I think it's one of the most poorly understood aspect of the ACL. The components, modules, and menu items and plugins all reference access levels. They must declare an access level. They can declare only one access level. They can't declare multiple access levels, whereas permissions can be set on multiple groups. So each of these has to set an access level. Now, what does access really mean? Most people think it's a view access only, that it only refers to what you can see on the front end of the web page, which would be the display, but it includes other things. For instance, a menu item is only involved about viewing. A module is only interested in, shall I display my content on this particular web page? So the access level for these two items is really tied only to display. Components are a double-edged beast. It basically says that they have templates that allow you to display the content. In that case, an access level will say, can I display this particular view? But it also contains content. For instance, the content of a category, a particular item, may not be displayed necessarily through this view. But if some other module wants to display that, the component, if it's built correctly, will block that content from being shown to any of the other modules, even though the module might be allowed to display. So the component has responsibilities for access level for both, and whether it displays through its views or whether its content should be granted. And we can go further if we have a report that's going to look at what articles are the most popular, and we set someone to an access level that is not able to see a certain portion of articles. If the component is built correctly, it will not show those articles in a view that's trying to show the most popular articles, because the access is now guarding not just the display of a particular view, but the content that's being held by that category or by a particular object. And a very lesser known aspect of access levels is the plugins. They allow you to have access levels. And if you think of access levels only as views, it seems like that's a very strange or a mistake. But what it actually does is, should the plugin fire whether or not you belong to an access level? Let me give you an example. If we have a plugin that does something simple like pulls in a style sheet into the web page whenever it's run, we can set that to an access level of registered, meaning that only registered people are going to see this particular style applied to all the pages. And someone who's not registered will not see that style sheet pulled in. We could have something more complicated, such as a plugin that's going to block access to a particular component or to a particular category in a particular component. And we can set that to a particular access. So anybody belonging to this access level, this plugin will fire and block them from having access to that component or that particular category or that particular item. And a plugin can do so many different behavioral things. If you think and create your own plugins, now you can control when those plugins fire by having an access level tied to it. It's a very very unknown behavior, or poorly known behavior, that has a lot of power if we leverage it correctly. And then there's access levels. What is an access level itself? Well, for each access level, all we do is get to say what group it belongs to. And in that case, I think we've got it poorly named. It shouldn't be access levels. I think it should be an access list. If you look at this little portion on the left, here's a list of all the groups for a particular installation of Joomla. And in this particular access level, only product manager is checked. It'd be something like this, only one group. So that means if a user belongs to any of the groups that I check, they now belong to this access level and have access, whether it's viewing something on the screen, whether it's access to content, whether it's access to a plugin firing. You can have multiple items. So if a user belongs to any one of these particular items, then we know that person has access. So an access level basically says, is this user included or is it excluded? It has nothing to do with levels. It only has something to do with a list. And I think we've gotten the problem of calling it access levels because we borrowed the term from 1.5. In 1.5, we could not create access levels, and we had only the fixed ones of public, registered, and special. Public is if you're in anonymously, registered if you logged in, and special would be things like admins. So we've kept the term. But now with 2.5 and 3.x, we can create all the access levels we want, give them their own unique names, and check whichever configuration we want for each particular access level. And so really, I prefer using the term access list, but I know that the Joomla term right now currently is access levels. So here again is the model, the bird's eye view of what the ACL is all about. Everything starts with a group. Users are assigned to a group, so for any given user, we know which groups they belong to. And this allows us to interface with the resources. Whether or not they have permissions to do things like create, edit, delete, set the state. Whether or not they have access to particular views, particular content, or the behavior of plugins. And that's how the whole ACL works. Groups, permissions, access levels, and how they interact with the rest of the Joomla system. I want to talk about user groups and the rest of the system, and basically what user groups can do. User groups allows us to do permissions, and they also allow us personalization. Permissions is tied to it. It's like user groups is a coin with two sides. Permissions, what can you do if you belong to this user group? Or personalization, how do we style and present the back end, which is a lot of my work in the IQ project. How do we do that based upon the user groups that someone belongs to? So let's first talk about permissions. This is the screen you'll see when you set permissions, and permissions can be set at the site level or on any particular component, and optionally on categories and on the items themselves. Since 3.x has come out, we now can have it also on modules. It did not get in the screen, but those are the items that can set permissions. Now, I mentioned that Joomla's ACL has some fixed parts of permissions, but there's several parts that the component is responsible for. Because components are unique, the ACL cannot force a lot of these things upon components. It's dependent upon a component. So if you think ACL is not behaving properly, it could be the component's not doing its job. Let's look at what these three things are. The first is to set a list of actions that can be done. Now these are the actions we see commonly. Actions, for instance, on content, which are the articles. Whether you can configure the whole application or component, whether you can access the administration interface, and then more commonly, whether you can create articles, delete articles, edit articles, and you can change them published to unpublished, and whether you can edit your own articles. But that's for content. Components have the ability to add their own actions based upon what they, the uniqueness of their component and how rich that component is. You're seeing here the actions used for EasyBlog, and they've been given us a very rich set of actions, which I wish more components would model. They have manage the bloggers, manage the settings, manage auto postings, manage the blogs themselves, so the categories, or pending blogs, tags, comments, and it goes down. There's actually more actions than I was able to put on this particular screen. I wish most components would give us this level of control. Joomla cannot force that upon a component because it has to be implemented within the component, and it's up to the component developer to implement this. It's also up to the component developer to decide if they're even going to implement permissions. Some components don't do that, and if they do implement permissions, do they contain categories? If they contain categories, it's up to them to say, do I want to offer permissions at the category level? And it's also up to them, do I want to implement permissions at the object level and offer that to the user to set on a particular object? If it's missing, it's because the component developer chose not to add it into his or her own component. So though we are dependent upon which actions, we are dependent on the component developer either putting on the component, maybe optioning on categories and objects. And the final thing that we are dependent upon the component developer is how they actually enforce the rules. The ACL can say, based upon your configuration you've given me, this person is allowed or not allowed to do such things, such as create, edit, change state. But in order, while the ACL can give that information out to the component, it's up to the component itself to determine, to implement the code that's actually going to enforce that this user can open an article and edit it, or open this item and edit it, or can create, or can delete, or can change states, or in the case of EasyBlog, maybe add tags or manage categories. That's all the responsibility that belongs to the component developer. ACL brings it to the component developers for them to use. The component developers must create the actions, must offer the various levels of permissions, and must enforce those permissions in the way it manages its code. So now we know that that's the case. How do we calculate the permissions? And a lot of people get confused. And it really is somewhat simple, but let's look what we have to consider first. We consider a particular action. So the action for edit is independent of all the other actions. The action for delete and create, they're all independent. So when we evaluate if a user is allowed or not, we look at the action, we look at that particular user, and which groups they belong to. If they belong to B1 and C, we inherit B, then the component needs to look at the permission settings for B1, B, and C. We take the results of these, whether it's inherited, whether it's allowed, or whether it's denied, and we see the results of all of them together. It's a very simple formula if you look at it this way. All we have are inherited. That's by default. We've done nothing. It's denied. So by default, we deny the action to any particular user. However, we find one allowed, or multiple alloweds, but we only need one, that person is allowed. The only exception to that is if we have a deny, an explicit deny. It is denied, even if this particular set has some allowed. Even if we deny it at the base class or the base group, and then allow it at a more derived group or the child group, it doesn't matter which order. We have a deny one place in there, a hard deny. It is denied. So it's simple. Nothing set, denied. You click something as allowed, it's allowed. If you have any hard deny, it's going to block all the other allows, and it's always denied. It's really not that complicated if you use a formula like this. And then when we have an extension or a component that actually has categories and objects as well, we have to think, well, how do we do this? Well, we look at all the different groups, and we add them all together. So instead of having 3, we're looking at 9, and it's the exact same formula that we had before. I found that this other model, which is looking at the same set of rules and how we figure this out, sometimes this model actually helps people comprehend the way permissions are handled. For instance, we have inherited, allowed, and denied. In this case, the component is inherited, the categories are inherited, and the individual items are all inherited. So you see the component's a square, the domino things are categories, and the little circles would be the items, articles, contacts, whatever the component's holding. If we make the component allowed, every category then is automatically allowed just because it belongs to this component. If I create a new category, that category also is allowed because it is contained by an allow. Any new items added to these categories or to a new category will be allowed unless I explicitly change it. Now, if we have the component not allowed, it's just inherited, but we make one category allowed, well, all these other categories, they're not allowed. They will be denied. But any item in this particular category will be allowed. The items that currently exist, new items added to it. will now be allowed. In this category, it's not allowed, but few items are allowed. So by inherited, any new items I add are going to be inherited, but these particular items will be allowed for the particular action and for that particular group when we look at all those sorts of things. This case shows some redundancy. I have the component allowed, and even though I made the category allowed and I made certain items allowed, it doesn't matter. They're all allowed regardless. All it takes is one allow, and the action is calculated as being allowed. But we do a change here. Now we have the component being allowed, and this category, though it's inherited, everything in it is allowed. New items added to it will be allowed. If I add a new category and it will be inherited, it will be allowed, and all its items will be allowed. But if we go and have one of the categories denied, every item in here is denied. Any new item that I create in it will be denied. In the bottom right one, even though the category is denied, and even though I've set some of its items to allowed, those items still will be denied because one denied overrules all the other allowed, whether it's allowed on the item or allowed on a containing thing such as the component. And in this area, the bottom left category, every item is going to be allowed except those that have been explicitly denied. But because the category is inherited, it inherits the allowed from outside. And that's a good model, I think, for understanding how permissions are calculated. But you don't have to do it all in your head. You can use something like this. This is an ACL manager, which I think it costs 25 to 30 euros, something like that, which is about $40 to $50 US. I think it's very wise to get this if you're doing any kind of significant ACL management. It gives you a good picture of what's going on. Actually, from this interface, you can click on these options, and you can toggle between inherit, allowed, and deny, and it will actually add it into the system. So this is for a particular user group. But if you want to look at a particular user, now we can break it down and see exactly the results of either allowed or denied. It's the only two options. And so we can look at the particular banners, for instance, as a component. We can look at its category. And if we want to click up here, we can say, look at the different items. You can list all the items. And it tells you for any one user, is that person allowed or denied this particular action for this particular component or category or particular item. And so ACL Manager is a great way to get your head around it. So you don't have to worry about all the calculations, because all the things, when you look at it, gets a very complex system. It's hard to manage, and the ACL Manager enables you to manage it reliably. So I mentioned user groups. We talked about permissions, how we calculate them, and I want to talk a little bit about personalization. I've been talking a lot about role-based ACL. I've written some articles on it, and I've given presentations on it. Due to the brevity we needed on this particular presentation, I'm not going into depth showing exactly how to set it up. But I would like to show you what a role-based ACL will do for you if you follow that particular practice. Remember, role-based ACL is different than what we get out of the box. We are creating our own particular groups, and each group is assigned its own role. Something like we see here is a user group, so it's just not what you see out of the box. For each user, we check off and say they belong to this. So this user belongs to order fulfillment, is a site auditor, and a store manager. Based upon the items that we check for that user, they see these different things when they log into the back end or into their dashboard. The order fulfillment module. Site auditor will see maybe reporting, and the store manager will see a module that contains different links to the store and managing stores, such as pricing, order fulfillment, that sort of thing. A different user is checked off in here and says event manager or testimonials. And if we look at that, this person sees different modules and different items that can access. Neither one can access what the other can access because they only access what we give them. If I wanted this person to see the reports, I could check the auditor, and they would see this particular report showing up. So we're able to personalize the experience of a user in the back end and even in the front end if we use the ACL correctly and use a role-based approach. Why don't we use role-based approach more out of the box? Well, 1.5 we had a very rigid ACL, very basic, and there's no flexibility. We had basically set levels of the different groups and access levels as well. So when 2.5 and 3.x came out, they allowed you to create your own user groups. They allowed you to create and configure your own access levels so people could understand mentally what how this translates, they basically configured the out-of-the-box user groups and out-of-the-box access levels to be pretty much identical to what we had in 1.5. But unfortunately, this leads people to think this is the way we use it. I've seen people say you should only check one item in the user group because that's all we could do back in 1.5. But if we go to a role-based approach, we have a much richer approach to how we do access control. We create all these different roles, and a person can belong to one or multiple roles, and based on those roles, we give them incrementally more permissions. We maybe allow them more access to view things in the back end. But it takes an understanding of role-based to know that we need to maybe remove some of these particular groups, or at least add additional ones in there that are role-based, and how do we apply them. So here's an example of what I just showed before of basically whatever you check, this is what someone sees in the back end. And I wanted to show a quick example. I worked in a county that had over 20 departments, and for each person who belonged to a department, they would see a totally different back end. Maybe they looked very similar in their icons, but the links brought them only to things that was relevant for their particular department. So here's this county auditor's dashboard. They'd be able to edit their own home page on the site. They could create and edit their own department pages, but they had no access to any other department pages. They had services, they could list the services. They had their own FAQs that they could create and manage themselves. They could create their own quick links. They could have their own announcements. Each department would have their own dashboard item like this, and each one would link to those things specific to that particular department. And so when they clicked on their pages, they would see only the items that they could do. If they create a new article, it goes into the auditor treasurer category. And if somebody was in sanitation or human services departments, it would go only to their particular category. And they can only edit those things. Even when it comes time to adding documents or adding images that need to be added, we use JCE and its access of group profiles in order to set it up so that when the auditor was editing a particular article, a PDF in this case, wanted to add them, they would send it only to the auditor's directory that's designated for that auditor. And if they deleted some, they're only deleting things from their own department. They're adding things only to their own department. They can access only documents in their own department. And it would be the same with images. Here's the sheriff's dashboard. They had some sub-departments, so the sheriff might see all these. If somebody's in the probation or the jail end, they would be able to access just these particular modules that they would see and manage it. But anybody at the head part of the sheriff's department would be able to see all these particular links on their dashboard. And then the webmaster usually has a more richer set of items. They may be added to be the calendar manager, or maybe somebody has that responsibility as calendar manager and sees only the calendar manager when they log in. But the webmaster sees all these different things, can manage their employment section, their announcements, manage security issues, webmaster issues, and manage the gallery. They could see the different reports that comes up on their particular website. And we can grant those based on what roles we want to assign to a particular user. So my work has been with the IQ project, and the things I just showed you on the customization of the back end or how the user experience is, I'm building tools with that, I'm exploring it. I encourage you to go to the IQ project, fill out a form here, and just be on the email list, getting notices of maybe a new product that's coming out, or a new technique, or some blog posting that I'm going to give. And I also have products that help you, enable you to take from the regular admin template and create what I call the client template, and the links that I was showing you, how you can customize it and tailor it. I'm trying to make it so it's very easy to use with these particular tools. So that's what I would like to just recommend if you're interested about the things I'm talking about and this particular approach. I don't have time to go into it, but the iqproject.com is where sign up and you'll get to learn a lot more about those sorts of things. I'm hoping that this bird's eye view of the ACL has been very beneficial to you. It's a different perspective than what a lot of people talk about when they take more of the street level. So I'm hoping that you've gained a lot, and thank you for your time. If Steve's got questions, he can read some questions, and I'll try to respond.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Randy.
Sure.
Do we have any questions at all from the audience? One fantastic presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
When will, this is the question we always get whenever anyone describe something they're working on. When will this particular component be available?
I'm planning, if it wasn't for preparing for this presentation, I would have had it launched this week.
Oh.
I basically, the products, I've been demoing it, and I hope this next week, if somebody wants to go out, there will be a slight subscription base to cover my costs. But then I plan on also developing additional products. I have like a form field manager that allows people to see what fields for a particular group. You see only these fields and not those fields. I have several talks on like streamlining the workflow, which is also linked to on the IQ project website. So those products, as I keep developing them, I give reports on them. I will post them, make them available. So by the time this goes on YouTube, the product, there should be enough things there for people to be able to download and be available then.
So, question, I'm looking for an ACL that's very strong in controlling the access based upon the individual user. And that's, we teach Drupal as well, which works on a role-based system, similar to Joomla in some ways. And that's what a lot of platforms do. Any thoughts on, because this question comes up a lot, any thoughts on something that's more focused on the individual user and specific user permissions rather than roles?
Yeah, I understand the users. I mean, you could always create a group for each user, but that's not always as practical. It depends on the particular need someone has. And to me, I don't just configure the parts I have. I'm a coder, so I know how to code solutions. I know how to build a plugin to make it work. And you can override layouts, for instance. If you say, I want a particular user to have something extra or suppress these fields or show an extra field, you can override a layout, the template layout, and check for the user's ID. And if the user belongs to a particular ID, we're going to do this. Now, it does get verbose that if you've got 100 users that each has special rules, I don't know if there's a shortcut whether you're using Joomla or Drupal. You basically have to, if it's a different rule for each user, you'll have to code it or configure it somehow. But if you want to go user independent, there's it's like JFactory get user, and an arrow is like get user ID or get ID. I'm saying this off from memory right now, but it's an easy way to get the ID, and if that user is a particular ID, you can add extra behavior, whether it's blocking, whether it's adding, whatever it is you want to do. So you can do it at the code level, and you can do it safely by using template overrides. Or if you want to code your own plugin, you can do it that way. So that's, when I get questions about individual users, I say it's probably a coded solution.
Yes, it's not a particularly easy approach, because so many of these platforms do work based on user groups, don't they?
Right. I mean, the idea is behind this is user groups take more of an expert to set up just right. And that's, we as site integrators are considered those experts. And the client who just knows their business and doesn't want to have to learn a CMS, they can easily get in and see this user and the set of roles. Well, I'll add this one to that role and that role. So the easy things that change a lot is a user assigned to a role. But the permissions behind a particular role or group takes a little bit more work, and that isn't changed as often. And that's the way Joomla approaches this, is that the site integrator sets up the group with the permissions, and it's easy to change people from this to that and add those incrementally. But if you have a particular set of permissions that has to go to this user and this user and that user, you either set up a set of groups or you're going to have to code it.
Well, great. Let me see if we're getting a lot of people saying thank you.
Sure.
Let me see. Okay, a bit of a longer question. I've had to build sites with no public access and have to put the site offline. And then we've created users with memberships in groups. Are there any practical variations on this letting people in with public access? I think I mangled that question. I apologize to the person asking the question. I think I may have to ask him to email you.
That's fine. I'm more than happy to answer people's questions by email. Or if I know it's on the forum, I can answer the forum and other people can see it later.
I think it was a variation of, this looks like quite a lot of work, which quite a few of the questions have been.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, and this is I was at the developers conference last week, and one of the points I wanted to make to a few people was that if we are experts, when I started doing web development in the 90s, I had to learn how to pull up Notepad and do coding. I learned code, and a lot of web developers don't know code, and I'm kind of like, well, I thought we were experts. We need to know that. And I understand, though, that a lot of it is you can configure your own solutions. But if we are experts, maybe you aren't an expert in ACL. Maybe you need to pull in an expert for a project. Or maybe what is it, expertise do you provide? And you add more value to yourself and to what you give to clients if you take the time to study this. And after a while, it becomes more second nature. ACL Manager will make it easier for you. And you can, so I mean, if you want to go further with it, it'll take you further, and you'll get more interesting projects if you can do it. So that's kind of my encouragement. Is like, yeah, there's a little more complexity, but that's why people hire us.
And so the best way to contact you would be to go to iqproject.com and hit the contact?
Yes, that'll work. iqproject.com and contact, yes.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Randy. People seem to have really enjoyed that and got a lot out of it.
Thank you.
And I apologize for delaying the launch of your component.
You're not the only one. The developers conference did it too. So.
Okay. Well, I wish you all the best with the launch.
Thank you very much.
So thank you again, Randy. Thank you guys for attending.